I'm Leo, 32 male. I live in a small house that has held 3 generations of my family's hopes and hardships, surrounded by the scent of sawdust and wood varnish. I'm a carpenter, and I find more peace in the grain of a freshly cut piece of oak than most people find in a savings account. For years, my life has been a quiet rhythm of work, paying bills, and caring for my mother. But a few months ago, a death in the family set off a chain reaction that took my quiet life and shattered it, replacing it with a secret so heavy it could have been forged from gold. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The news of my Uncle Arthur's passing arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a phone call that felt both inevitable and surreal. He was my father's older brother, a man who had spun a small inheritance into a sprawling empire of real estate and shipping. To the rest of the world, Arthur was a titan of industry, a name whispered with a mixture of awe and envy. To me, he was a distant, imposing figure who appeared at holiday gatherings in tailored suits, his presence casting a long shadow over the rest of us. He was a constant, unspoken reminder of the vast gulf between his world and ours. My world was a 2-bedroom house with floors that creaked and pipes that groaned in the winter. My workshop in the garage was my sanctuary, a place where I could transform raw lumber into custom furniture. The work was honest and hard, my hands calloused from the labor, but it paid the bills, most of them anyway. My mother, Clara, spent her days in the rocking chair my father had built for her decades ago, her hands now too frail for the gardening she once loved. Her medical costs were a quiet, constant pressure, a tide that always threatened to rise higher than I could manage. But we had each other, and as she always said, a home filled with love was richer than any mansion filled with loneliness. My cousins, Marcus and Isabel, would have scoffed at that sentiment. They were Arthur's other heirs, and they had spent their entire lives orbiting his wealth, convinced it was their birthright. Marcus, 3 years my senior, was a self-proclaimed entrepreneur who floated from one failed venture to the next, always cushioned by a generous allowance from Uncle Arthur. He wore his arrogance like an expensive watch, flashing it at every opportunity and looking down on my life of manual labor as if it were a contagious disease. Isabel was just as entitled, though her cruelty was sharper and more direct. She saw my modest existence as a personal failing, a stain on the family's otherwise polished reputation. At our last family Christmas, she glanced at the hand-carved wooden ornament I'd brought as a gift and remarked loud enough for everyone to hear, "How quaint." Leo is still playing with blocks. In the days between the funeral and the reading of the will, the family's whispers grew into a deafening roar of speculation. Marcus was already talking about which of Arthur's sports cars he would claim first. Isabel was debating whether to redecorate the lakefront mansion or simply tear it down and build something more modern. They spoke of the $35 million estate not as a gift, but as a transaction that was long overdue. Listening to them felt like watching vultures circle, their greed so palpable it seemed to suck the air out of the room. I held no such grand expectations. I had always been on the periphery of Arthur's life, an afterthought in the grand narrative of his success. My father, his brother, had chosen a different path, a life of quiet integrity and simple means, and I had followed in his footsteps. Still, a small, stubborn part of me hoped. Not for a fortune, not for a mansion, but for a sign. A sign that my uncle had seen me, that he had recognized the quiet dedication with which I cared for his sister-in-law, my mother. I hoped for a small inheritance, enough to ease the burden of Clara's medical bills and fix the leaking roof. It was a humble wish, one I kept locked away in my own heart, too fragile to expose to the cynical expectations of my relatives. My mother seemed to sense my inner turmoil. The evening before the will reading, she called me over to her chair, her eyes clear and steady despite her physical weakness. "Don't measure your worth by what's written on that paper tomorrow, Leo," she told me, her voice a soft anchor in my sea of anxiety. "Your uncle was a complicated man. He valued strength, but he didn't always show it in conventional ways. Whatever happens, you are your father's son. That is a legacy no lawyer can give or take away." I held on to her words like a talisman as I walked into the lawyer's office the next day. The room was paneled in dark mahogany, the air thick with the smell of old leather and entitlement. Marcus and Isabel were already there, seated in plush chairs, looking as if they owned the place. Marcus gave me a dismissive nod, while Isabel simply looked through me. They were peacocks preening in their fine clothes, their faces alight with anticipation. I took a seat in the corner, my work trousers and simple button-down shirt feeling woefully out of place. I felt like an intruder at a royal coronation, a commoner who had wandered into the king's court by mistake. The lawyer, a stern-faced man named Mr. Abernathy, cleared his throat and began to read. The legalese washed over me, a drone of trusts and bequests, until he reached the names I was waiting for. As expected, Marcus inherited a sprawling estate in the countryside, along with Arthur's entire collection of vintage automobiles. A smug, triumphant grin spread across his face. Isabel was granted a trust fund so vast that the number of zeros seemed almost comical. She let out a small, satisfied sigh, the sound of a predator who had finally secured her kill. My relatives murmured their approval, their nods and smiles affirming that the world was unfolding exactly as it should. The rightful heirs were receiving their kingdom. Then Mr. Abernathy looked down at his papers, a slight, almost imperceptible frown on his face. He cleared his throat again before speaking my name. "And to my nephew Leo," the lawyer read, his voice devoid of emotion, "I leave one old metal toolbox, contents unknown." For a single silent moment, the words hung in the air, suspended in the space between expectation and reality. I blinked, certain I had misheard. A toolbox. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Then the silence was shattered by a sound that started as a snort and quickly erupted into full-blown laughter. It was Marcus. He threw his head back and roared, his laughter echoing off the mahogany walls. Isabel joined in, a high, piercing giggle that sounded like breaking glass. "A toolbox," Marcus gasped, wiping a tear from his eye. "That's perfect. He left the junk man a box of junk." Isabel leaned forward, her eyes glittering with malice. "I suppose Arthur thought you should stick to what you know, cousin," she said, her voice dripping with condescending pity. "You can't exactly fix a leaky roof with stock certificates, can you?" Her words were a direct hit, a calculated strike at the heart of my quiet hopes. The other relatives in the room, aunts and uncles who had known me my entire life, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few offered weak, sympathetic smiles, but no one spoke up. No one dared to challenge the narrative that had just been solidified in front of them. Marcus and Isabel were the winners, and I was the punchline. My face burned with a heat that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. It was the hot, suffocating fire of humiliation. I felt the eyes of everyone on me, their gazes a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. I kept my spine straight, my hands clasped tightly in my lap to keep them from shaking. I focused on a point on the far wall, a small, insignificant crack in the plaster, and poured all my energy into maintaining a mask of calm indifference. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. Mr. Abernathy slid a small, rusted metal box across the polished surface of the table. It was exactly as described, old, dented, and streaked with rust. A relic from a bygone era, the kind of thing you'd find abandoned in a shed. I stood up, my legs feeling strangely disconnected from my body, and walked to the table. I picked up the toolbox. It was heavier than I expected, its cold, rough surface a stark contrast to the smooth, expensive paper my cousins were now signing with triumphant flourishes. As I turned to leave, Marcus stepped in front of me, blocking my path. He looked down at the toolbox in my hands and then back at my face, his smirk wider than ever. "Don't spend it all in one place, Leo," he sneered, his voice low enough for only me to hear. "Maybe there's a priceless collection of rusty nails inside." I met his gaze, my own expression unreadable. I didn't say a word. There was nothing to say. I simply walked around him and headed for the door, the sound of their stifled chuckles following me out into the hallway. The walk from that office to my old pickup truck was one of the longest of my life. Every step felt heavy, as if the weight of their judgment was physically pressing down on me. They were inside, celebrating their new fortunes, while I was outside, clutching a piece of scrap metal. The toolbox was a symbol of everything they thought I was: hardworking but poor, simple and unimportant, a man destined to live a life of scraps. When I arrived home, my mother was waiting in her usual spot, the rocking chair by the window. She took one look at my face and knew. She didn't ask what I had received, she didn't need to. Her gaze fell T. "Oh, the toolbox," I placed on the kitchen table with a dull thud. "This is it," I said, my voice hoarse. "This is what he left me." She studied the box for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She ran a frail hand over its rusted lid, her touch surprisingly gentle. "Your uncle never did anything without a reason," she said softly. "He was a builder, Leo, just like you. He understood that sometimes the most valuable things don't glitter." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to see some hidden meaning, some secret purpose in this cruel joke. But all I could see was the smug look on Marcus's face. All I could hear was Isabel's mocking laughter. The humiliation had settled deep in my bones, a cold, bitter ache that wouldn't go away. That night I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling. The will reading replayed in my mind on a loop. It wasn't about the money. I had never truly expected a fortune. It was about the gesture. It was about the public declaration that in the grand scheme of the Holloway family, I was worth nothing more than a discarded toolbox. Uncle Arthur had been a man who measured everything. He calculated risks, he evaluated assets, he assessed value. And in his final assessment, this box was the sum total of my worth. The betrayal felt profound. It wasn't just from my cousins, whose cruelty was a known quantity. It was the betrayal from the one man whose respect I had secretly craved. He hadn't just overlooked me, he had gone out of his way to single me out for ridicule. He had handed my cousins a kingdom and handed me a joke, then invited the whole family to watch and laugh. As I finally drifted into a restless sleep, I felt a familiar sense of resignation settle over me. My life was what it was. I was a carpenter, a caregiver, a man of simple means. And maybe I thought with a pang of bitterness that's all I was ever meant to be. The toolbox sat on the table, a silent monument to my perceived failure. For 3 days the toolbox remained on my kitchen table, an unwelcome guest that I couldn't bring myself to banish. Every time I passed it, a fresh wave of humiliation washed over me. It was a physical manifestation of my cousin's scorn, a constant silent mockery. I tried to ignore it, throwing myself into my work, the rhythmic rasp of sandpaper on wood a welcome distraction. But even in my workshop, the image of that rusty box was burned into my mind. My mother, in her infinite wisdom, said nothing. She let me wrestle with my anger and disappointment, knowing that some battles had to be fought alone. She simply made sure my coffee was hot in the morning and that a warm meal was waiting for me at night, her quiet support a lifeline I desperately needed. On the third evening, just as dusk was settling over the neighborhood, a sleek black sports car pulled up to our curb. My stomach tightened into a knot. It was Marcus. He sauntered up the walkway as if he were visiting a property he was considering buying, his expensive leather shoes clicking on the cracked concrete. He didn't even bother to knock, simply pushing the door open and leaning against the frame with a predatory grin. "Evening, cousin," he said, his voice oozing false charm. "Just thought I'd stop by and see how the other half lives, settling into your vast new fortune." I stayed seated at the table, my hands clenched into fists under the worn wood. "What do you want, Marcus?" I asked, my voice flat. His eyes landed on the toolbox and his grin widened. "Ah, there it is, the Holloway family jewels. Have you had it appraised yet? I'm dying to know what a lifetime supply of tetanus is worth these days." From the living room, my mother's voice cut through the tension, sharp and firm. "That's enough, Marcus. You've said your piece, now leave." For a moment, he looked taken aback, unused to being challenged. But he recovered quickly, shrugging his shoulders in a theatrical display of innocence. "Just checking in," he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. He shot me one last look, a look that said, "This is your life and this is all it will ever be." Then he turned and strolled back to his car, his laughter floating back through the open door as he sped away. The sound of his engine fading into the distance was replaced by a roaring in my own ears. I stared at the toolbox, the object of his ridicule, and something inside me snapped. The humiliation curdled into a white-hot rage. I stood up, grabbed the box, and stormed towards the back door, fully intending to hurl it into the scrap heap behind my workshop. I wanted it gone. I wanted to erase the memory of the lawyer's office, of my cousin's laughter, of the crushing weight of their judgment. But as I lifted it, ready to throw, my mother's words echoed in my mind. "Your uncle never did anything without a reason." I paused, my arm still raised. The box felt heavy. Not just the physical weight of the steel, but something more, a dense, solid feeling that seemed wrong for a empty container of old tools. Curiosity for the first time began to outweigh my anger. I carried the box back to the kitchen table and set it down, my movements now deliberate and focused. I opened the creaking lid. Inside, just as I'd seen before, was a collection of worn-out tools, a hammer with a cracked wooden handle, a set of mismatched wrenches, and a grimy tape measure. Nothing of value, nothing that could explain the unusual weight. I closed the lid and lifted the box again, shaking it gently. There was no rattle of loose items, just that same solid, bottom-heavy feeling. I turned it over, running my fingers along the scratched metal base. My thumb caught on a thin, almost invisible seam running along the edge. It wasn't a single sheet of metal. It was a panel. My heart began to beat a little faster. I hurried to my workshop, returning with a slim, flathead screwdriver. With trembling hands, I wedged the tip into the seam and pried. The metal groaned in protest, but slowly, reluctantly, it began to give way. I worked my way around the edge, my breath held tight in my chest. With a final sharp pop, the false bottom came loose. I lifted the panel away and stared into the hidden compartment beneath. My mind raced with possibilities. Gold coins. A stack of bonds, a deed to a forgotten property. But what lay inside was far stranger than anything I could have imagined. Nestled in a bed of faded velvet was an old, clunky flip phone. It was the kind of device I hadn't seen in at least 15 years, with a thick plastic body and a small, stubby antenna. I stared at it bewildered. A phone? Why would Uncle Arthur go to the trouble of hiding an ancient piece of technology in a secret compartment? It made no sense. This had to be the final, most bizarre part of his cruel joke. Disappointment, sharp and bitter, replaced my fleeting hope. I reached in and picked it up, its plastic casing cool against my skin. It felt like a relic from another lifetime. On a whim, I pressed the power button on the side, fully expecting nothing to happen. To my utter astonishment, the tiny screen flickered to life, emitting a pale green glow in the dim light of the kitchen. And then, before I could even process what was happening, the phone began to ring. The shrill electronic melody was so loud, so jarring in the silence of my home that I nearly dropped it. My heart leaped into my throat. The screen flashed with a single, insistent word, incoming. My mother had come to stand in the doorway, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. "Answer it, Leo," she whispered, her voice barely audible. My hand was shaking as I fumbled with the buttons, finally managing to press the green accept key. I lifted the phone to my ear, my pulse hammering against my ribs. "Hello," I managed to say, my voice a dry croak. A low, calm voice responded, a voice I had never heard before. "Leo," it said, the tone steady and deliberate. "If you are hearing this, it means Arthur trusted you." The voice paused, letting the words sink in. "The real inheritance begins now." The words echoed in the sudden silence that followed, seemingly absorbed by the very walls of my small kitchen. My mind struggled to catch up, to make sense of the impossible situation I found myself in. A hidden phone, a mysterious caller, a promise of a real inheritance. It felt like a scene from a movie, completely detached from the grounded reality of my life. My throat was tight, and it took me a moment to find my voice. "Who is this?" I asked, the question coming out as a strained whisper. "That will become clear in due time," the voice replied, its calm, measured tone doing little to soothe my frayed nerves. "For now, all you need to know is that your uncle was a man of great foresight. He chose you, Leo. He chose you for a reason. Listen carefully and follow my instructions precisely. Do not speak of this to anyone. The others, your cousins, they would not understand. This is a matter of trust, not greed." And with that, the line went dead. The silence that rushed back in was heavier than before, filled with 1,000 unasked questions. I slowly lowered the phone, staring at its blank screen as if it held all the answers. My mother stepped forward, her hand coming to rest on my shoulder, a small, warm point of stability in my spinning world. "What did he say, son?" I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. He said Uncle Arthur trusted me. He said this was the beginning of the real inheritance." Her eyes, usually clouded with the weariness of age and illness, were suddenly sharp and clear. "I told you," she said, a note of quiet triumph in her voice. "Arthur was a complicated man, but he was not cruel. He saw the rod of greed in Marcus and Isabel. He saw their sense of entitlement, but in you he saw your father. He saw a man who understands loyalty." Her faith in me, so unwavering and absolute, was a balm to the wounds left by the will reading. For the first time since that humiliating day, a flicker of hope ignited within me, fragile yet persistent. This wasn't a joke, it was a test, and somehow I had passed the first stage. The phone lay dormant on the table for the rest of the evening, a silent promise of things to come. I barely slept that night, my thoughts racing. Who was the man on the phone? What was this so-called real inheritance? And why had Arthur constructed such an elaborate theatrical puzzle? The questions were a relentless storm in my mind, and with them came a healthy dose of fear. Marcus's sneering face flashed in my memory. If he ever suspected that my toolbox contained more than rusty nails, his greed would become a dangerous, obsessive force. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I had to protect this secret at all costs. The call came the following evening, just as I was cleaning up after dinner. The same shrill ring, the same calm voice on the other end. "Leo," it began without preamble. "It is time for the next step. There is a self-storage facility on the outskirts of town, secure lock storage on Route 4. Go to Unit 117. The access code for the main gate is the year you graduated from high school. The code for the unit's lock is the date of your father's birthday. Month, day, year." My breath caught in my throat. These were not random numbers. They were pieces of my life, details so personal that no stranger could possibly know them. The year I tossed my graduation cap into the air, a moment of youthful triumph. The birthday of the father I still missed every single day. This was a message, loud and clear. "We know you. We chose you. Go tonight," the voice continued, its tone leaving no room for argument. "Go alone. Do not let anyone see you." The line went dead. I relayed the instructions to my mother, whose expression had become a mixture of excitement and grave concern. "Be careful, Leo," she warned, her hand clutching my arm. "If Arthur went to these lengths to hide something, it must be valuable, and valuable things make people do desperate things." An hour later, I was behind the wheel of my beat-up pickup truck, the old flip phone in my pocket and the toolbox locked securely in the passenger seat. The night was dark and moonless, the road ahead illuminated only by my headlights cutting a lonely path through the darkness. Every pair of headlights in my rearview mirror sent a jolt of paranoia through me. Was that Marcus? Had he been watching me? I took a series of unnecessary turns, my heart pounding, until I was satisfied that I wasn't being followed. When I finally pulled up to secure lock storage, the place looked deserted. A tall chain-link fence topped with barbed wire surrounded rows of identical corrugated metal doors. It felt like a fortress. I took a deep breath and punched the gate code into the keypad. The year I graduated. The heavy iron gate groaned and then slowly slid open. I drove inside, the crunch of gravel under my tires sounding unnaturally loud in the dead quiet. The facility was arranged in a grid, the rows of units lit by harsh yellow security lights that cast long, distorted shadows. I found Unit 117 at the far end of a row, tucked away in a poorly lit corner. I parked the truck, killed the engine, and sat for a moment in the sudden, profound silence. My hands were slick with sweat as I got out and walked to the unit door. On it was a heavy-duty digital lock. I hesitated for only a second before entering the code, my father's birthday. As I pressed the final digit, the lock beeped twice and a green light flashed. With a heavy, satisfying clank, the mechanism disengaged. I gripped the cold metal handle, took one last look around the deserted facility, and pulled the door upwards. It rolled open with a rattling echo that seemed to shake the entire row, revealing the dark, cavernous space within. The air that rolled out of the storage unit was cool and smelled of dust, concrete, and something vaguely metallic. I fumbled for a light switch just inside the door, and a single bare bulb flickered to life, casting a pale, clinical glow over the contents of the unit. It was larger than I had expected, meticulously organized and clean. Against the back wall were three large, military-style metal crates, each one stenciled with the initials AH, my uncle's initials. To the side stood a simple wooden desk and a chair, looking strangely out of place amidst the stark functionality of the rest of the unit. On the desk, placed perfectly in the center, was a single, thick manila envelope. My name, Leo, was written across the front in a bold, familiar script. It was Uncle Arthur's handwriting. My legs felt unsteady as I walked towards the desk. This was it, the moment of truth. My hands trembled as I picked up the envelope and tore it open. Inside was a letter several pages long, written on heavy, cream-colored stationery. I sat down in the chair and began to read. My dearest Leo, the letter begins. If you are reading this, it means you have passed the first and most important test. It means you did not discard the toolbox in anger, but instead allowed your curiosity and intelligence to guide you. It means you have the patience and character I always suspected you possessed. I know that what transpired at the lawyer's office was a source of great pain and humiliation for you, and for that I am truly sorry. It was a necessary cruelty. I had to see how you would react when you believed you had been left with nothing. I also had to give your cousins exactly what they wanted, to feed their insatiable greed so they would be too busy counting their silver to look for the gold. They have inherited my properties and my liquid assets, the visible, gaudy trappings of wealth. It will be their ruin. They lack the discipline and the wisdom to manage it, and it will consume them. That is their inheritance, a gilded cage. But you, Leo, I have left you the foundation. You have inherited the engine of my life's work. I watched you for years. I saw you give up your own ambitions to care for your mother. I saw the pride you take in your craft, the way you shape wood with your hands, creating things of beauty and function from raw materials. You have your father's humility and his strength. You do not hunger for wealth, and so you are the only one I can trust with it. Inside these crates is my true legacy. It is not just money, but a responsibility. Protect it, nurture it, use it to build something that lasts. You are my choice, Leo. You were always my choice. Tears welled in my eyes, blurring the words on the page. I had to stop reading, my chest tight with an emotion so overwhelming it felt like a physical weight. It was validation, it was absolution. The shame that had clung to me for days began to dissolve, replaced by a profound, earth-shaking sense of purpose. I had not been forgotten, I had been chosen. After composing myself, I turned my attention to the crates. Using a crowbar that was leaning against the wall, I pried open the first one. The lid came off with a groan of protesting metal. I stared down, my breath catching in my throat. It was filled with gold bars, dozens of them stacked in neat, gleaming rows. The sight was so surreal, so far beyond the scope of my reality that I could only stare in stunned silence. The second crate was just as shocking, packed to the brim with tightly bound stacks of cash in multiple currencies. The third crate, however, was different. It contained no precious metals or currency. Instead, it was filled with a dozen thick, leather-bound journals, a series of rolled-up maps, and a heavy ring of old-fashioned skeleton keys. I picked up one of the journals and opened it. Every page was covered in my uncle's precise handwriting, detailing decades of investments, business strategies, and private notes on properties and assets that were clearly kept off the official books. This was the roadmap. This was the engine. Just as I was beginning to grasp the sheer scale of what was in front of me, the flip phone in my pocket buzzed to life. I answered on the first ring. I have the letter, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I've opened the crates. Then you understand, the calm voice replied. What you see is the culmination of your uncle's life. The gold and cash are your tools, the journals are your guide. Arthur believed you had the character to build, not just to spend. Why me? I asked again, needing to hear it one more time. He barely knew me. He knew you better than you think, the voice said. He saw that you were not broken by hardship but strengthened by it. He knew you would honor his legacy, not just liquidate it. This is your responsibility now, Leo. Suddenly, the quiet of the facility was broken by the sound of an approaching engine, its low rumble growing steadily louder. Headlights swept across the front of my unit, casting a brief, bright glare inside before moving past. My blood ran cold. I ducked instinctively, my heart hammering against my ribs. Peeking through a small gap in the door, I saw a familiar black sports car come to a stop a few rows down. It was Marcus. He got out of the car, his phone pressed to his ear. I don't know, he has to be here somewhere, I heard him say, his voice sharp with irritation. His piece of junk truck is parked right there. The loser is hiding something, I can feel it. He must have followed me. In my relief and excitement, I had let my guard down. The phone in my hand buzzed with an incoming text message from the same unknown number. Lock the unit. Leave now. Do not engage. Protect the assets. My hands moved with frantic speed. I slammed the lids back onto the crates, threw the letter into the one with the journals, and yanked the heavy door of the storage unit down. It shut with a deafening bang. I fumbled with the keypad, punching in the code to lock it just as I heard Marcus's footsteps get. Ting closer, Leo, he shouted, his voice echoing in the cavernous facility. I know you're in there. What are you hiding in there, huh? Finally found a buyer for your precious toolbox. I forced myself to breathe, to walk calmly toward my truck as if I had nothing in the world to hide. I turned to face him, my expression a carefully constructed mask of boredom. What do you want, Marcus? I said, my voice steady. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes narrowed with suspicion, scanning the locked unit door behind me. Don't play dumb with me. You've been acting weird ever since the will reading. What's in that unit? I met his gaze, and in that moment something shifted inside me. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. I was no longer the man he thought I was. It's nothing that concerns you, I said, my tone final. I climbed into my truck, started the engine, and looked at him one last time through the open window. Uncle Arthur left me exactly what I deserved. I pulled away, leaving him standing there alone under the harsh yellow lights, his face a mixture of anger and confusion. As I drove out of the gate and back into the anonymity of the night, I knew that this was more than just the beginning of a new inheritance. It was the beginning of a war. Returning home that night felt like crossing a threshold into a new life. I walked through the door a different man than the one who had left a few hours earlier. The weight of the secret I now carried was immense, but it was a grounding weight, not a crushing one. My mother was waiting up for me, a silent vigil in her rocking chair. She didn't need to ask what had happened. She saw it in the way I carried myself, in the new light of determination in my eyes. I sat down opposite her at the kitchen table and told her everything, the letter, the gold, the cash, the journals. I described the immense trust Arthur had placed in me and the terrifyingly close call with Marcus. She listened without interruption, her hands folded calmly in her lap. When I finished, she simply nodded as if this were the most natural outcome in the world. Your uncle built an empire from nothing, she said, her voice filled with a quiet pride. He needed to be sure his foundation would go to a builder, not a demolition crew. Those journals are your inheritance, Leo. The gold is just the raw material. What you do with it now will be your legacy. Her words became my compass in the weeks that followed. My life became a study in contrasts. By day, I was still Leo the carpenter, sanding down tabletops and delivering custom cabinets, my hands covered in sawdust. But by night, I was a student, poring over Arthur's journals under the dim light of a single lamp. The journals were a revelation. They were part business masterclass, part personal confession. Arthur detailed every major decision he'd ever made, explaining his logic, his strategies, and most importantly, his mistakes. He wrote about the loneliness of wealth, the constant paranoia, and the way it poisoned relationships. He described his profound disappointment in Marcus and Isabel, whom he saw as shallow reflections of his own worst impulses, ambition without principle, and a desire for reward without effort. In me, he wrote, he saw a chance for redemption, a way to ensure his life's work would be used for creation rather than just consumption. As I absorbed his knowledge, my confidence grew. The fear I once felt toward my cousins began to transform into a kind of detached pity. They were trapped in a game I was no longer playing. Their attempts to bait me became almost pathetic. Isabel called one afternoon, her voice a syrupy blend of fake concern and sharp-edged curiosity. Leo, darling, she cooed, I was just thinking about you. Are you managing all right? It must be so difficult with everything. The old me would have been stung by her condescension. The new me simply replied, I'm doing just fine, Isabel, thanks for asking. The line was silent for a moment, her confusion palpable. Oh, she finally said, her tone flat. Well, all right then. She was trying to get a reaction to confirm her belief in my misery, and when I refused to give it to her, she had nothing left to say. Marcus was more persistent. His suspicion had festered into a full-blown obsession. He started driving by my house at odd hours, his black sports car a menacing presence on our quiet street. He'd call and hang up. One Saturday, he showed up at my workshop unannounced. He stood in the doorway, surrounded by the smell of cedar and varnish, and watched me work. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he said, his voice a low growl. "You think you pulled one over on all of us. But I'm going to find out what you're hiding, Leo. I swear I will." I didn't stop my work. I continued to plane a piece of maple, the shavings curling at my feet. I looked up at him, my gaze steady. "There's nothing to find, Marcus. You're chasing Shaw." Dow's, my calmness infuriated him. He had built his identity on being the one with power, the one who was superior. My refusal to be intimidated by him was a direct challenge to his entire worldview. He stormed off, slamming the door behind him, but I knew he wouldn't give up. The final confrontation came a month later. I had started to put Arthur's plan into motion, setting up a small, discreet corporation through a lawyer Arthur had recommended in his journals. I had moved the assets from the storage unit to more secure, anonymous locations. One evening, as I was helping my mother into the house after a doctor's appointment, Marcus's car screeched to a halt in my driveway, blocking me in. He got out, his face flushed with rage, and marched towards me. "I've had investigators looking into you," he spat, his voice shaking with fury. "You've been meeting with lawyers, setting up accounts. Where did you get the money, Leo? What did you steal?" I made sure my mother was safely inside before turning to face him. I was no longer afraid. I was just tired of his anger, his greed, his emptiness. "I didn't steal anything," I said calmly. "Don't lie to me," he roared, jabbing a finger at my chest. "Arthur left you nothing, a box of junk, so tell me the truth right now. What did that old man really leave you?" I looked him straight in the eye, and for the first time I didn't see a powerful man. I saw a scared little boy, terrified that someone else had gotten a toy he wanted. The words came to me then, simple and absolute, the final, undeniable truth of our situation. "He left me something you'll never understand, Marcus," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "He left me his trust." The words struck him like a physical blow. He staggered back, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning comprehension. Trust. It was a currency he had never valued and could never possess. It was an inheritance beyond his reach, more valuable than all the mansions and cars in the world. He stared at me for a long moment, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a hollow, defeated look. He didn't say another word. He just turned, got back into his expensive car, and drove away. I never heard from him again. In the months that followed that final, quiet confrontation with Marcus, a new kind of peace settled over my life. The absence of my cousin's corrosive presence was like the lifting of a lifelong storm. The air was clearer, the days brighter. My focus shifted entirely to the immense responsibility Uncle Arthur had entrusted to me. Guided by his journals and my mother's unwavering moral compass, I began to put the inheritance to work. My first priority was my mother. I used a small fraction of the funds to pay off all her outstanding medical debts. I then purchased a comfortable single-story home in a quiet neighborhood, one with wide doorways for a wheelchair she would one day need and a beautiful garden where I could plant the flowers she loved. The look on her face when I showed it to her was a reward greater than any amount of gold. For the first time in decades, she was free from the anxiety of looming bills and the physical struggles of our old, crumbling house. Seeing her happy, truly and deeply happy, was the first return on Arthur's investment. I did not abandon my own life's work. My workshop remained my sanctuary. If anything, my passion for carpentry deepened. I hired a couple of young apprentices from the local community, kids who were struggling to find their path, and taught them the craft. I established a small business building high-quality, handcrafted furniture. It was successful on its own terms, a legitimate enterprise that had nothing to do with my inheritance. It was important to me that I continue to be a builder, a man who earned his living with his own two hands. That, I felt, was the truest way to honor both my father and my uncle. The vast majority of Arthur's fortune, however, I channeled into philanthropy, always acting through anonymous trusts and foundations as he had advised. I learned from his journals that true power lay not in public recognition, but in quiet, effective action. I funded a complete renovation of the rundown community center where I had spent so many of my afternoons as a teenager. I established a scholarship fund for students attending trade schools, giving kids who worked with their hands the same opportunities as those who went to university. I made a significant anonymous donation to the local free clinic, ensuring it could keep its doors open for families like mine had once been. Each act was a quiet tribute to the man who had seen my potential. I was using his legacy to build a better community, to create opportunities where there had been none. News of Marcus and Isabel occasionally trickled back to me through the family grapevine. Just as Arthur had predicted, their inheritances had become their ruin. Marcus, in an attempt to prove he was a business mogul of high S. uncle's stature, poured millions into a series of high-risk, flashy tech startups, all of which failed spectacularly. He was forced to sell the vintage cars one by one and eventually the mansion itself, his pride and arrogance eroding with his bank account. Isabel found that a life with no purpose and unlimited funds was a gilded cage indeed. She drifted through a haze of lavish parties and expensive vacations, but her eyes in the few photos I saw were empty. Her wealth had isolated her, leaving her with a life of superficial connections and profound loneliness. They had been given everything they thought they wanted, and it had brought them nothing but misery. The old, rusty toolbox now sits on the mantel above the fireplace in my new home. It's the first thing I see when I walk in the door and the last thing I see before I turn out the lights. To any visitor, it's just a curious piece of rustic decor. But to me, it's a constant reminder. It reminds me of humiliation and of vindication. It reminds me that the greatest treasures are often hidden within the most humble of packages. It reminds me that a person's worth is not determined by the judgment of others, but by their own character and integrity. Uncle Arthur didn't just leave me money, he left me a mission. He gave me the chance to prove that a life built on loyalty, hard work, and quiet dignity is richer than one built on greed and entitlement. He trusted me to finish his story, and I spend every day trying to write a final chapter worthy of that trust. The real inheritance wasn't the gold in the crates, it was the purpose I found when I opened them. And that is a fortune that will never run out.